Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to speak about something that often goes unnoticed, but cuts deeper than many wounds: the act and dark psychology of ignoring a woman. To ignore is not merely silence, it is a weapon. When a woman is ignored, dismissed, or treated as if her voice carries no weight, it is not just an absence of words, it is the deliberate stripping away of dignity. Ignoring is not passive, it is active, it is intentional, and it is psychological. Why is it dark psychology? Because it is rooted in control. Silence becomes a form of manipulation, where the person who withholds attention or acknowledgement gains a false sense of power. Ignoring a woman can force her to question her worth, her beauty, her intelligence, even her very existence. It is not just not listening, it is erasing. It is making her feel invisible in a world where she already has to fight to be seen. But make no mistake, this act does not reflect the weakness of the woman ignored, but the insecurity of the one who ignores. For it takes no strength to withhold love, to deny acknowledgement, or to turn away from a human being seeking connection. It takes fear. Fear of confrontation, fear of accountability, fear of genuine intimacy. And yet society often normalizes this silent cruelty. How many times have we heard phrases like, "just ignore her," as if silence is a strategy, a tactic, a game. But women are not games to be won or lost. Women are not puzzles to be solved through absence. Women are human beings deserving of respect, of presence, of voice. So I say this: to ignore a woman is not power, it is cowardice. To ignore a woman is not strength, it is weakness disguised as silence. And while the dark psychology of ignoring may succeed in wounding temporarily, it can never extinguish the spirit of a woman who knows her worth. Because when a woman learns to rise above the silence, to speak even when she is not heard, to value herself beyond the validation of another, then the act of ignoring loses its grip. Let us not participate in silence as violence. Let us not weaponize absence. Let us instead choose acknowledgement, presence, and respect. For every woman deserves to be seen, to be heard, and above all, to never be ignored. Thank you. Ignoring is never neutral, and when directed toward a woman, it takes on a sharper, more destructive edge. To ignore is not simply the absence of speech or the lack of attention. It is an active choice, a deliberate act of exclusion. It communicates a powerful, painful message: you do not matter. When a woman is ignored, her voice, her presence, and her humanity are stripped of acknowledgement. It is not silence as peace, it is silence as punishment, silence as weaponry. In this sense, ignoring is one of the most subtle, yet most piercing forms of psychological harm. Think about the nature of human beings. We are wired for connection, for acknowledgement, for recognition. A child cries not merely for food but for attention, for eye contact, for the assurance that someone sees them and cares. As adults, this need does not vanish. Every person longs to be seen, heard, and validated. When those basic needs are denied, it creates a wound that lingers in the invisible spaces of the mind. For a woman, particularly in a world where she often has to fight to be noticed in the first place, being ignored is not just personal, it echoes centuries of silencing. It carries weight far beyond the single moment. The act of ignoring masquerades as passivity, but it is anything but passive. To ignore is to make a conscious decision to withhold acknowledgement. It is to say, "I see you, but I choose to pretend that I do not." This choice is a form of domination, because it places one person in the position of gatekeeper, the one who decides whose voice is valid and whose presence can be erased. In this way, ignoring becomes a tool of psychological warfare. It destabilizes confidence. It forces the ignored person to question not the act, but herself. Did I do something wrong? Am I not enough? Why am I invisible? The cruelty lies in the way the burden of doubt shifts onto the woman, rather than the one who inflicted the silence. Unlike words, which can be countered or challenged, silence leaves no direct opening for response. It denies even the possibility of engagement. That is why it is so potent as a weapon. A cruel remark can be debated, disproven, or dismissed. But silence offers no such clarity. It lingers, unanswered and unanswerable, gnawing at the edges of self-esteem. In relationships, silence can be used as a tactic of control. the infamous silent treatment. It may seem mild compared to overt aggression, yet research in psychology has shown that being ignored triggers the same regions in the brain as physical pain. The body interprets it as a form of harm, because at our deepest level, exclusion threatens our sense of survival. When a woman is ignored, it is not only her that suffers. Ignoring diminishes the humanity of the one who ignores as well. It reveals a lack of courage, a refusal to engage in the difficult but necessary work of communication. Yet society often fails to call this out. In everyday life, we hear casual advice such as just ignore her or don't give her attention. Such phrases normalize the idea that a woman's feelings, concerns, or expressions are undeserving of recognition. This normalization makes the weapon of ignoring even sharper, because it cloaks cruelty in the disguise of common sense. The effect, however, is far from harmless. Imagine a woman speaking in a group, and her voice passes unheard while a man repeats her words minutes later and is applauded. Imagine a partner refusing to respond to messages, not out of busyness, but out of calculated dismissal. Imagine society watching these moments and shrugging as though nothing has happened. These examples show that ignoring is not neutral. It erases identity, diminishes self-worth, and communicates the message that her existence is negotiable. But here lies the deeper truth. Ignoring wounds because acknowledgement is life-giving. A glance, a nod, a word. These small acts affirm that someone exists, that she matters, that her voice has weight. To deny that is to starve the soul of recognition. And yet, while ignoring can scar, it cannot define. For every act of silence imposed upon a woman, there lies the possibility of resistance, the power to reclaim her own voice, to see herself when others refuse to look, to affirm her own worth, even in the void of acknowledgement. In the end, the weapon of ignoring reveals more about the wielder than the one targeted. It exposes a reliance on control rather than compassion, avoidance rather than honesty, fear rather than strength. But for the woman, recognizing that ignoring is not about her inadequacy, but about another's insecurity, becomes the first step toward breaking its psychological hold. To ignore may be intended as erasure, but the act of surviving it, rising above it, and speaking louder in the face of silence is proof that ignoring can never fully succeed. The psychology behind ignoring is not as simple as indifference. It is not just a person being too busy or distracted to respond. It is often a calculated, deliberate act that operates on a much deeper level, rooted in control and manipulation. When someone chooses to ignore a woman, it is not about silence alone, but about creating a subtle imbalance of power. It is a psychological maneuver meant to influence her emotions, destabilize her confidence, and position the one who ignores as the figure in control. This is what makes it a dark psychology, because it is hidden, quiet, and insidious. To understand why ignoring is rooted in control, one must first recognize the nature of human interaction. Relationships, whether romantic, professional, or social, are built on acknowledgement. Even simple gestures like eye contact or a nod of recognition establish equality and respect. When this acknowledgement is withheld, it shifts the dynamic. The one who ignores takes on the role of the decision-maker, deciding when, how, and if interaction will occur. This imbalance is what transforms silence into power. By choosing not to respond, the one ignoring implicitly says, "I am the one who decides when you matter." That message alone can be crushing. This tactic is especially cruel because it exploits one of the deepest human needs, the need for belonging. Psychologists often refer to social pain, the pain of rejection or exclusion, as being neurologically similar to physical pain. Studies using brain imaging show that being ignored activates the same regions as being physically hurt. This explains why a woman who is deliberately ignored may feel a knot in her stomach, a heaviness in her chest, or a sharp pang in her heart. It is not all in her head. It is her brain signaling that something vital is being taken away. The person who ignores may not strike her with fists or cut her with words, but the silence they impose can leave wounds just as real. Control through ignoring often shows up in subtle ways. In relationships, it might appear as the infamous silent treatment, when one partner withholds conversation, affection, or acknowledgement as a punishment. On the surface, it may look like nothing more than silence, but underneath it is a calculated move to make the woman feel guilty, anxious, or desperate to restore harmony. In the workplace, ignoring may take the form of colleagues or superiors failing to acknowledge contributions, overlooking ideas, or speaking over a woman while pretending her voice was never there. In friendships or family dynamics, it might be the choice to exclude her from decisions, to pretend she is not present, to diminish her presence by withholding acknowledgement. In each case, the message is the same: her value depends on someone else granting her recognition. The psychology behind this is manipulative because it is designed to create self-doubt. When a woman is ignored, she begins to search for reasons within herself. Did I say something wrong? Was I not clear? Do I not matter? The one who ignores rarely needs to justify themselves. They have shifted the emotional burden onto her. That is the hidden brilliance and the hidden cruelty of this dark psychology. It is power exercised without a word spoken. Yet, it is important to uncover what lies beneath such behavior. At its root, ignoring is less about strength and more about insecurity. The person who ignores often fears confrontation, honesty, or vulnerability. They use silence because it allows them to avoid engaging directly with emotions they cannot manage. Rather than facing conflict or admitting weakness, they retreat into a tactic that shields them from accountability. By controlling communication, they believe they are protecting themselves while simultaneously dominating the other. In reality, it reveals not superiority but fear. When this tactic is normalized, it becomes even more dangerous. Society sometimes frames ignoring as wise or strategic. Just ignore her and she'll stop, or don't give her attention. This framing disguises manipulation as maturity, and in doing so, it validates the act of erasing someone's voice. Women are then left fighting not only against the silence of one person, but against a culture that condones it. But the control that ignoring seeks to impose is fragile. It only works when the woman accepts the narrative that her worth depends on acknowledgement from another. Once she recognizes that the silence is a tactic, not a truth about her value, the hold begins to weaken. By understanding that ignoring is rooted not in her inadequacy, but in another's insecurity, she can reclaim her own power. She can learn to see the act not as a reflection of her worth, but as an exposure of the other's fear. The psychology of ignoring thrives in the shadows, where it goes unnamed and unnoticed. Bringing it to light is the first step to dismantling its power. When women understand the mechanism behind it, they are no longer passive recipients of silence, but active challengers of it. They can call it out, refuse to internalize it, and most importantly, refuse to allow it to define their value. When a woman is ignored, the impact does not remain on the surface. It seeps into her thoughts, her emotions, and her sense of self. Ignoring is not a simple act of withholding attention. It is a form of psychological harm that plants seeds of doubt in the mind of the person on the receiving end. It forces her to question not only the situation, but herself, her worth, her beauty, her intelligence, her importance. Over time, this erosion of confidence becomes one of the most dangerous consequences of being ignored, because it does not strike in one loud blow, but chips away quietly, piece by piece, until self-belief begins to crumble. At first, the experience of being ignored can feel confusing. A woman might reach out in conversation and receive silence in return. She might share her ideas only to watch them dismissed or overlooked. She might call, message, or attempt to connect and be met with nothing. In the beginning, she may rationalize it. Perhaps he is busy, perhaps they did not hear, perhaps it is just coincidence. But when the pattern continues, confusion turns into doubt. That doubt, left unchecked, takes root in the mind. It tells her, maybe I am not interesting, maybe what I have to say has no value, maybe I am not good enough. This is the cruel psychological trap of ignoring. It transfers responsibility from the one who ignores to the one being ignored. The human brain is wired to seek connection, and when it does not receive acknowledgement, it perceives it as rejection. Rejection is painful not only emotionally, but biologically. Studies in neuroscience have shown that social exclusion and being ignored activate the same neural pathways as physical pain. This means that when a woman is deliberately ignored, her body registers it almost like an injury. The tightness in the chest, the hollow feeling in the stomach, the restless anxiety, these are not imagined sensations, but very real signals of the harm being inflicted. Unlike physical wounds, though, The pain of ignoring is invisible, leaving her to question if what she feels is valid. Over time, repeated experiences of being ignored can create a cycle of self-doubt. A woman might second-guess her words before speaking, worried she will once again be dismissed. She may withdraw socially, silencing herself before others silence her. She may even begin to measure her worth through the acknowledgement or lack thereof given by others. This is where the act of ignoring becomes not just situational but systemic, shaping her behavior and self-image in profound ways. It can diminish confidence in professional settings, undermine trust in personal relationships, and weaken the resilience needed to navigate life's challenges. What makes this harm particularly dangerous is its subtlety. Harsh words can be named and confronted. Open rejection, though painful, is at least clear. But ignoring is ambiguous. It is silence, and silence leaves room for interpretation. In that void, the woman fills the silence with self-criticism. If they are not responding, then something must be wrong with me. This internalization of blame is where ignoring exerts its deepest psychological power. But while ignoring creates doubt, it also reveals an important truth. The doubt is not born from weakness in the woman, but from the absence of acknowledgement given to her. It is a natural human response to question oneself when faced with silence. Understanding this truth is critical, because it shifts the narrative away from self-blame. The harm lies not in her worth, but in the act imposed upon her. The problem is not that she is unworthy of attention, but that someone has chosen to withhold it. Recognizing this distinction can become the turning point. Once a woman understands that being ignored does not define her value, she can begin to reclaim her sense of self. This does not erase the sting of silence, but it gives her power over its meaning. She can say, "This silence is not a reflection of me, but of them. Their choice to ignore is their weakness, not my inadequacy." In this reframing, the doubt that once eroded her confidence can be countered with a stronger truth. Her worth exists independently of acknowledgement. It is also important to remember that the effects of ignoring do not only harm the individual, they ripple outward. When women are silenced through dismissal, society loses voices, ideas, and contributions that could have shaped progress. Ignoring does not only wound privately, it impoverishes communities by erasing perspectives. Every time a woman is ignored, her potential impact is diminished, and the collective loses something valuable. In the end, the psychological harm of being ignored is real and lasting. It creates self-doubt, erodes confidence, and causes emotional wounds that are invisible yet profound. But naming the harm is the first step toward healing it. By recognizing that ignoring is a tactic of control, not a reflection of personal inadequacy, women can begin to break free from the cycle of doubt it creates. They can choose to affirm themselves even when others withhold acknowledgement. And in that choice, they reclaim the very power that silence seeks to take away. Ignoring a woman often masquerades as strength. To the outsider, the one who withholds words, attention, or acknowledgement may appear composed, unshaken, even powerful. Silence is frequently mistaken for dominance, as though by refusing to engage, the ignorer is somehow above the situation, untouchable and in control. Yet beneath this facade lies a far different reality. Ignoring is not a demonstration of strength, but of insecurity. It is not power, but avoidance. It is not mastery, but fear. To ignore a woman reveals not the superiority of the one who does it, but the inability to face truth, vulnerability, or confrontation. Strength, in its true sense, demands presence. It takes courage to look someone in the eye and speak honestly, even when the conversation is uncomfortable. It takes maturity to listen, to respond, to engage with another person's feelings and perspective. To turn away, to refuse acknowledgement, is easier, but also weaker. It avoids responsibility under the guise of control. It is much simpler to remain silent than to say, "I was hurt," or "I disagree," or "I am afraid." But simplicity does not equal strength. Silence in this context is not noble restraint, it is a retreat. For a woman on the receiving end, this can be particularly devastating, because ignoring often comes dressed in the clothing of superiority. She may believe the one ignoring her is above her, more powerful, more stable. She may even mistake his silence for wisdom or emotional control. But when the mask is stripped away, What is revealed is someone who lacks the courage to meet her as an equal. If he truly possessed strength, he would communicate rather than erase. He would confront rather than withdraw. He would acknowledge rather than pretend she does not exist. The insecurity behind ignoring can take many forms. Sometimes it is the fear of conflict. A man, a colleague, a partner may avoid engagement because he fears what will be revealed when the conversation unfolds. He fears anger, disappointment, or the possibility of losing control. Instead of facing these fears, he hides behind silence. At other times, the insecurity lies in vulnerability. To listen and respond means opening oneself to the emotions of another, and some lack the confidence to withstand that intimacy. By ignoring, they shield themselves from exposure, but in shielding themselves, they harm the other, projecting their fear onto her as rejection. This is why ignoring cannot be mistaken for strength. True strength does not run from emotion, it endures it. True strength does not deny the existence of another, it respects it. True strength does not cower in silence, it speaks with clarity and honesty, even when the words are difficult. The act of ignoring a woman does not elevate the one who ignores, it diminishes him. It exposes his inability to communicate with integrity, to hold space for another person's humanity, to rise above fear and insecurity. Yet society too often glorifies silence. People say, be the bigger person and don't respond, or just ignore her. Such phrases frame ignoring as wisdom, as though the refusal to engage is the mark of a strong mind. But there is a difference between choosing peace and imposing silence. Choosing peace is when someone decides not to fight, not to escalate, but still acknowledges the other person with respect. Imposing silence is when someone refuses to acknowledge the other at all, using absence as punishment. These two acts are worlds apart, yet society often confuses them. This confusion allows insecurity to masquerade as strength, hiding the truth of what ignoring really is. For the woman who is ignored, understanding this distinction is vital. The silence directed at her is not a sign that she is unworthy. It is not proof of another's superiority. It is evidence of another's inability to face her with honesty. His silence is not a reflection of her weakness, but of his own. Recognizing this truth helps lift the heavy weight of self-blame. It reframes the act of ignoring from something that diminishes her to something that exposes him. The irony is that in trying to appear strong, the one who ignores only reveals his frailty. His silence says, I cannot handle this. I do not know how to engage. I am afraid of what will come if I acknowledge you. These admissions are never spoken aloud, but they echo in the emptiness of what is withheld. And for the woman who learns to see this clearly, silence loses its sting. It no longer feels like the voice of judgment, but the sound of insecurity disguised as control. To ignore a woman is not strength. It is weakness, wrapped in the illusion of power. It is cowardice cloaked in calm. It is avoidance pretending to be superiority. True strength is not in denying someone's existence, but in recognizing it with courage, honesty, and respect. When women come to see the act of ignoring through this lens, they reclaim their power. They understand that the silence says more about the one who withholds it than about themselves. And in that understanding they rise, knowing that their worth cannot be diminished by the weakness of another's fear. Silence has long been romanticized as wisdom, and society has often portrayed the act of ignoring as a reasonable tactic. From casual advice given in friendships to strategies offered in relationships, the phrase "just ignore her" is repeated with the ease of a proverb. On the surface, it seems harmless, even logical. Ignore what bothers you, and it will fade. Ignore the noise, and you will find peace. But when directed toward a woman, this advice becomes a mask for dismissal, a tool for erasure. It is the normalization of silencing, disguised as strategy. This is where the act turns not only personal but cultural, embedding itself into the very fabric of how women are treated in both private and public life. When society teaches men to ignore her, it frames the woman as the problem. She becomes a nuisance, an irritant, a distraction to be avoided rather than a human being to be acknowledged. Her emotions are trivialized, her words reduced to noise, her presence rendered unworthy of attention. This conditioning runs deep. Boys are taught to treat a girl's persistence as clinginess. Partners are told to teach her a lesson by withholding affection. Even in professional settings, Women are advised to toughen up when colleagues cut them off or gloss over their contributions. This normalization of ignoring does not simply overlook women, it actively sustains the imbalance of power between genders. The danger lies in how ordinary this practice becomes. Because ignoring does not shout, it slips quietly into culture without raising alarm. Unlike overt discrimination or direct insult, it does not leave visible marks. Yet its subtlety is precisely what makes it so insidious. When women are ignored, the act is often dismissed as unintentional or harmless. "He didn't mean it." "You're overthinking." "Don't take it personally." These responses minimize her experience, teaching her to doubt her own perception. The harm of ignoring thus becomes twofold. First, the pain of being dismissed, and second, the denial of the pain itself. Consider the workplace. A woman raises her hand in a meeting, offers a suggestion, and it is passed over in silence. Minutes later, a man repeats the same idea, and the room applauds. This scene plays out in offices across the world, and too often it is brushed off as coincidence. But it is not coincidence, it is cultural conditioning. The habit of ignoring women has been normalized to such an extent that even those who do it may not recognize their behavior. And yet, for the woman ignored, the message is loud and clear. Your words hold less weight. In relationships, the normalization of ignoring manifests in the infamous silent treatment. Couples' advice columns, rather than condemning it as toxic, sometimes frame it as a legitimate strategy. Pull away to teach her patience, withhold attention to make her realize your worth. These suggestions elevate manipulation into method, disguising emotional cruelty as wisdom. But what is taught as strategy is in truth control. By normalizing such tactics, society encourages the idea that women must earn back acknowledgement, that their voices are conditional privileges, not inherent rights. Even in broader cultural narratives, ignoring women has been woven into entertainment and tradition. How many stories portray the aloof man, the one who withholds affection, as the figure of strength and desirability? How often is the persistent woman portrayed as desperate, her silence-seeking partner as the one in control? These images reinforce the idea that ignoring is not only acceptable but attractive, further entrenching the notion that silence equals superiority. The normalization of ignoring is not only harmful to women, it impoverishes society as a whole. When women are silenced, the collective loses innovation, empathy, and wisdom. Each ignored voice is a perspective that could have shaped policy, art, science, or community. The normalization of ignoring narrows humanity's vision, leaving half of its brilliance unseen and unheard. What begins as a tactic in a relationship or a workplace becomes a cultural epidemic, stripping society of voices that could change it for the better. Breaking this cycle requires recognition. The first step is naming ignoring for what it is. Not a strategy, not maturity, not wisdom, but dismissal. It is a practice rooted in inequality, reinforced by cultural habits, and masked by phrases that make cruelty sound clever. Once named, it can be challenged. This means calling out moments when women are dismissed in conversations, refusing to accept silence as a legitimate response to emotional needs, and re-educating society to see acknowledgement as strength rather than weakness. For women themselves, recognizing the normalization of ignoring is a form of liberation. It removes the sting of self-blame and reframes silence as a reflection of systemic patterns rather than personal inadequacy. When she realizes that being ignored is not about her unworthiness, but about cultural conditioning, she can begin to resist the weight of dismissal. She can insist on being heard, not as a request, but as a right. In the end, what society calls strategy is often silence disguised as wisdom. But ignoring a woman is not clever, it is corrosive. It is not strength, it is suppression. And until we dismantle the normalization of ignoring, women will continue to carry wounds that are dismissed as invisible, though they cut as deep as any spoken insult. To unmask this truth is to begin the work of change, for the silence we allow today becomes the culture we inherit tomorrow. When a woman is ignored, the immediate effect may be pain, confusion, and self-doubt. But that is not where the story ends. Over time, silence can either weaken her or strengthen her, depending on how she responds. The act of ignoring seeks to diminish, to erase, to reduce her sense of self. But within that same act lies an unintended opportunity, the chance for her to rise above it. The power of ignoring begins to collapse the moment a woman refuses to let another person's silence dictate her worth. True empowerment begins when she understands that acknowledgement from others is valuable, but not essential to her existence. Her value is not contingent on attention. It is inherent. This is not to dismiss the pain of being ignored. The sting is real, and the wounds of silence cut deep. It is natural for a woman to feel invisible, to question herself, to wonder why her presence is being denied. But the transformation comes when she recognizes that the silence says more about the one who imposes it than about her. Their silence is not proof of her inadequacy. It is evidence of their fear, their insecurity, their inability to meet her strength with honesty. In that recognition, the hold of ignoring begins to break. When a woman rises above silence, she does not do so by shouting louder or demanding acknowledgement from those who withhold it. Her power is not in begging to be seen, but in refusing to vanish. She continues to speak, to create, to act, even if the audience refuses to listen. She validates herself. She becomes her own witness, her own affirmation, and when she does, the weapon of ignoring loses its sharpness, because its strength relied on her internalizing the silence. Once she refuses to internalize it, silence becomes just noise, or rather the absence of it. Empowerment through resistance to silence is an act of defiance. It is choosing to exist fully even in the face of erasure. It is standing tall even when society looks the other way. History is full of women who were ignored, dismissed, or silenced, yet continued to move forward. Writers whose works were rejected until they self-published, leaders who were excluded from decision-making until they built their own movements, voices that sang even when no one listened. Their strength was not in being granted acknowledgement, but in refusing to stop speaking. That is the essence of rising above silence, persistence in the face of dismissal. On a personal level, this means cultivating self-worth that is independent of external validation. A woman who knows her own value cannot be undone by silence. She may feel the sting, but it does not define her. Instead, she defines herself. She sets her own standards, writes her own story, and measures her worth by her own scale. This does not mean she closes herself off from others or rejects connection. It means she no longer places her identity in the fragile hands of those who might withhold acknowledgement. The act of reclaiming voice after being ignored is also an act of healing. It is a declaration. I am still here. For every woman who has been silenced in a conversation, dismissed in a relationship, or overlooked in a workplace, the choice to keep speaking, to keep showing up, is radical. It shifts the power dynamic. Suddenly, the silence no longer controls her. She controls how she responds to it. That shift, though quiet, is revolutionary. What ignoring tries to do is erase, but what resilience does is inscribe. A woman who refuses to be erased writes herself back into existence through action, through voice, through presence. In doing so, she not only heals herself, but also becomes an example for others. She shows that silence is not the end of the story, only a page within it. Her defiance becomes inspiration, reminding others that acknowledgement is a gift, but not a necessity for worth. The empowerment that comes from rising above silence is not about becoming untouchable or unfeeling. It is about acknowledging the pain but choosing not to be defined by it. It is about saying, yes, this hurt me, but it will not own me. It is about transforming wounds into wisdom, invisibility into independence, dismissal into determination. Ultimately, ignoring a woman may succeed in wounding her temporarily, but it cannot extinguish her spirit if she decides otherwise. The act loses its power when she realizes her voice carries weight even if no one claps, her presence matters even if no one looks, and her worth exists even if no one acknowledges it. This is the highest form of empowerment, not waiting for validation, but embodying it. When a woman rises above silence, she transforms what was meant to weaken her into the very source of her strength. She turns absence into resilience, dismissal into defiance, and erasure into existence. And in that transformation, the dark psychology of ignoring collapses under its own weight, proving that no silence can contain a woman who knows her own worth.